A roads deal, finally. Voters say no to a couple of disgraced lawmakers. What's ahead for Southfield's new mayor? And the gloves come off in the GOP race. MiWeek starts right now.
Detroit Public TV is supported by Business Leaders for Michigan, announcing open registration for the Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac, Detroit. Keynote speaker is Tom Kelly, leader of a global design firm helping organizations innovate and grow. Motivational speakers, networking opportunities, and creative inspiration. That's the Business Leaders for Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac. Info at businessleadersformichigan.com/events. Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. We have a deal. 4 years in the making, but state lawmakers finally reached an agreement on how to pay for road repairs. We'll be paying for it at the gas pump and when we register our vehicles. So coming up tonight, we're going to take a closer look at the road funding package and we're going to debate whether it's a bad deal or a good deal for Michigan. Also coming up tonight for you, 2 disgraced state lawmakers lose miserably in their bid to win back their seats. Is this the last we will hear from Todd Corser and Cindy Gamrat? Plus, the city of Southfield has a new mayor. We will take a look at the massive challenge he faces to redevelop the Northland Mall property. And what's going on with Republican presidential candidates? Now they're engaged in a fierce debate about their televised debates. We're going to talk about that. But we do start tonight with the long-awaited deal on road funding that's now awaiting Governor Snyder's signature. The agreement will eventually, and that's the key word, eventually, pump $1.2 billion a year into fixing the state's crumbling roads. But that's not until 2021. In the meantime, the state will begin to shift up to $600 million a year from the general fund to help with the repairs. Here are the details for you. The state gasoline tax will rise by 7.3 cents per gallon beginning in 2017. For diesel fuel, the tax increase will amount to a little over 11 cents per gallon, and registration fees for passenger vehicles and trucks will jump by 20%. The plan also calls for a couple of tax relief components to benefit residents. But overall, is this a bad deal for anyone who drives in Michigan? And that's where we start our conversation tonight with our contributors, Nolan Finley from the Detroit News. Stephen Henderson is off tonight, and sitting in for him is Nancy Kaffer from the Detroit Free Press. All right, guys. Nancy, it's good to see you. Welcome back to MiWeek.
Thank you for having me.
All right, in order to celebrate not only Nancy being here, but also the fact that we have a roads deal, the finest champagne that PBS could buy are inside these mugs here today as we celebrate the roads deal, right?
That's not true.
That's not. Thanks, Nolan. Thanks for playing along as usual.
I was told there would be champagne.
Exactly. I feel like the show is off to a rip-roaring start so far.
Not true.
All right, so let's get into the roads deal. Since you're in such a good mood today, I'm going to start with you, Nolan. Is this a good deal?
It's the best deal they could get. So in that sense, it's a good enough deal. I mean, this, if you put it in the context of the environment in which it was passed, the opportunity for a great deal, or for a really good road deal, passed last fall when they failed to do it in the lame duck session and kicked it over to voters in the form of Prop 2. And the overwhelming, Prop 2, Prop 1, what was it?
It was Prop 1.
Prop 1. But the overwhelming defeat of that in the spring, I think, eliminated the possibility of getting getting this thing done right. I mean, you had lawmakers scared to death to do an all-tax deal. You just had some thinking that you shouldn't do any deal at all because the voters had spoken. So when you think about 4 years of standoff, you finally got a deal that will provide some money for roads. It's not perfect by a long shot. It's not even really good by a long shot. But it's good enough, and I think it was the best you could hope for.
All right, so good enough, yeah. When I was reading the details of it, I kind of went, eh. So Nancy, what would your first just gut reaction? Is this a good deal?
I would agree that it's probably, I wouldn't even say the best deal that we could get. I'd say maybe the only deal that they could get. The thing that particularly troubles me is that half of the revenue to pay for roads comes from new revenue, the gas tax, the registration fee increase. The other half comes from this prospect of shifting $600 million, which actually grows to $800 million by 2021 out of the general fund. That's a lot of money. It's going to be about 7% of the general fund by the time we get to hit 2021, and it's $806 million. That's not like change that's in the sofa cushions. This is stuff that's going to come along with real cuts to services. The governor believes that economic growth is going to balance that out. I think we are predicted to have economic growth. Forecasts get wobblier the further out they go. And we also know that there are some cost factors out there that are going to gobble up a lot of that growth, like having to pay more for our share of the Medicaid expansion, other things with unemployment and more public assistance cases. I mean, there's stuff out there that's going to eat up that growth.
Yeah, so I mean, so is it really two things? Is this a bad gamble or a very risky gamble, Nolan, in terms of thinking, well, yeah, the state is going to do better by X amount of time, and the fact that no one knows where the cuts are going to be coming from the general fund,
Well,
what services or what things could be cut.
I mean, that's where the cowardice was in this thing. It pushes those hard decisions off to people who aren't in the legislature today and aren't in the governor's office. This deal counts on the longest sustained economic recovery since World War II. I think between now and 2021, the prospect of an economic downturn is pretty high, pretty realistic. I think that roads should be funded by user fees the way we've always funded them. Gasoline tax, fuel tax, and registration fee. And I can't for the life of me figure out why these lawmakers felt it's okay, there's less risk in raising it 7 cents than raising it 15 and getting the whole thing done through user fees. Once you've raised the tax, I mean,
someone can say you voted for raising a tax.
And so no matter what happens with gas prices now, as soon as they spike, people are going to say, that's because of the gas tax. So you might as well have gone in whole hog. You're going to take a hit anyway. And the other thing about it is postponing the benefit so long. You've raised the tax, and people aren't going to see a real difference in terms of road work for 4 or 5 years to come. And so people are going to be out there saying, look, I'm paying all this more money for gas taxes and my roads are still lousy. I think the politics of it didn't make sense.
Yeah, the politics didn't make sense. The timing doesn't make sense. Go ahead, Nancy.
They can theoretically borrow against the new revenues, but they can only borrow against the $600 million that's coming from
Not
fees.
A significant amount of money.
They can't borrow against $600 million in theoretical cuts. Like, that's just not something the bond market's going to go for. So
all right.
and
plus, I mean, by raising registration fees, now every year people are reminded that their taxes went up. If you just put in a straight fuel tax at a time when gas is what, $2.20, $2.19 a gallon, people would have grumbled for a few weeks here, and then it would be, the natural scope of thing. We're still $1.50 cheaper than we were at our high point.
Let's talk a little bit about the timing. The fact that it's not rolling out until 2017, and and again, the full effect of a $1.2 billion to fix the roads, Nancy, is not coming until 2021. When the reality is the price tag for roads is probably going to be much higher by that point as well.
No, there's that too. We've talked about how the roads are getting worse every month we delay, every winter we delay. I mean, the only question here, this is the only deal they could get. But would it have been better to say, hey, we're not doing a roads deal right now because we can't get a reasonable deal? I don't know that was a bit of a palatable solution either. But in effect, it's almost like we have no roads deal for the next couple of years. So it's a real bizarre situation.
Well, I mean, it's next year. I mean, in fiscal year 2016, the money's already in the
before the full amount.
In 17, I mean, you do start to get some revenue from this thing coming in 17, revenue that you can spend, and it also takes some pressure off the general fund budget in 2017 because it pulls out that $400 million that was in this year. The problem is you're not going to see any real significant improvement in roads for a long time, and meanwhile, I mean, they're not just going to remain the way they are. They're going to keep getting worse.
They're going to keep getting worse.
By spring, they're going to be miserable.
You know, what I think is also interesting too is we are also counting on lawmakers that we don't maybe even know yet, and we haven't even elected yet, who are going to be making these decisions about cuts and about funding. So everyone who made the decision this week, in a couple years from now, a lot of them might be gone.
Yeah, I think they will be gone, the majority of them. And this is another interesting thing about this is the current legislature, binding a future legislature to its will is not something that always works the way they intend it to.
You wrote a column a couple days ago, Nolan, saying that basically Snyder had to go in and bust up some kneecaps to get this deal done. Do you feel that he did that this week and he should come out of this as a good victory for him, that he was able to round the troops up, or what do you take away from that politically?
It's a minor victory for him, and no, I don't think he ever did do that sort of hard sell, hard pressure He didn't get what he wanted in this deal. He got some of what he wanted. The governor wanted a straight user fee, pay for roads, leave the general fund alone, and that's the way it should have been. But, I mean, this falls on him in a lot of ways. He should have never allowed that proposition to go on the ballot this spring. He should have held this over, walked away from it last fall and started over with the new legislature and not tied their hands with that awful proposal.
You know, Nancy, you made an interesting point that, you know, this is the deal that just kind of had to get done. People have been so disappointed with lawmakers in Lansing. They've been disappointed with Congress as well, but that's an entirely different conversation. But do you believe that this maybe takes off the heat that people say, well, at least they made some kind of decision, or are we still going to hear the drumbeat for, hey, part-time legislature, we need to change the system?
I don't know that this actually does make people happier with the legislature because, yeah, they got a deal done, but it's a deal that I think all of us are in agreement is a really problematic deal, and the coverage of this deal is reflecting that. When they had the Prop 1, they came to agreement on Prop 1 and put that on the ballot, that didn't mollify voters. In fact, it seemed to enrage them because they shot it down by an enormous margin. I mean, I don't really know who this benefits politically because it, as Nolan said, you know, there's still a tax increase. For people who care about that, that's a huge problem. There's going to be service cuts. That's a huge problem for people who care about that. I mean, it seems like you can please some of the people some of the time. This seems like pleasing none of the people none of the time.
And that's right, because, you know, the legislature really couldn't win here because there was a strong contingent of folks who believe that, well, we pay as much in gas taxes as everyone else. Why are our roads so lousy? Why should we have to pay more? There was others who said, hey, we decided on this in May. We said we didn't want this. And there's a whole lack of trust in the highway department as well. People don't believe the roads are getting fixed right. Nothing the legislature could have passed would have helped them.
But then you also have, you know, House Speaker Kevin Cutter, who believes that there's waste that can contribute a lot to getting rid of $600 million from the general fund.
Well, how come they haven't found it before, I guess?
$600 million is a lot of money. We're not talking about 10 million or 20 million. We're talking, this is a lot of money. And so you have someone in the leadership who's propagating this idea that you know, maybe cutting $600 million is not such a big deal, which, you know, he spoke with the absent Stephen Henderson on the radio last week and seemed to really think that money you put into services wasn't going to be touched by this, or that they could move some stuff around and everything would be okay.
Well, you can do a little of that. I mean, you could cut $500 million out of corrections in a very short time with common sense sentencing reform.
But that is going to require a lot more than that's not just an across the line cut.
There's a strong contingent that is opposed to.
And this is going to force people to make really difficult choices about that sort of thing. I don't think we can keep spending $2 billion a year.
Yeah, but what we've seen so far is the legislature is not really, they're not really wanting to make these difficult decisions.
And every dollar you spend has a constituency in the legislature, and this is going to have to force them to make some hard choices. And the easiest place to get this money is common sense sentencing reform. We lock up too many people. We cut the prison population by 25–30%. You save $500 million. Well, you're a long way towards your savings then. But we've been resistant to doing that.
So all right, last word, Nance.
Good news, everyone. Gear up for another 4-year fight on sentencing reform, is I think what Nolan's forecast here.
I really do think there's a movement.
You make me start sweating, for heaven's sake.
There's a movement toward sentencing reform, both at the state and federal level. I think that's going to happen, and I think you can get considerable savings out of that.
All right. Well, we'll have to see what happens there in the next couple of weeks, and especially as Lansing starts to tackle Detroit schools. Well, it was a bad week for second chances. Speaking of Lansing, seems Todd Corser and Cindy Gamrat scandal is finally over. As you remember, Corser resigned and Gamrat was kicked out of the legislature after they used staff to try to cover up their extramarital affair. And on Tuesday, they tried to win back their seats, but voters said no way in what must have been a relief to the Michigan Republican Party. Nolan, let me start with you. I mean, this was a last-ditch effort on their parts. I was surprised that they even made this effort. But do they now quietly go away?
Oh, I assume so, but I'm glad they did make this effort, because now they can't say, well, it was our fellow lawmakers who didn't like us because we were this or because we were that. Now voters have spoken and said, we don't want you. You know, we don't want you in the legislature, and so now they have nobody to blame but themselves for this thing. And I think that was a good affirmation by the voters on Tuesday.
What's the fascination of this there, Nancy?
I was going to say, I feel like they may try to blame someone other than the voters for this.
Of course.
What's the fascination with?
Yeah, with this, because because there were camera crews from ABC following them around on election night, so you can only imagine some kind of 2020 special might be coming out of this.
I mean, there's been so much outrageous behavior, particularly from Todd Courser, that I think that. There's no telling what he's going to do, and everybody wants to be there to capture it, I guess, if he did something wacky. He's been such a flamboyant and bizarre figure through all of this, with the attempted cover-up of his extramarital affair by starting a rumor that he had been caught with a male prostitute. I mean, this is the old saying about you can't make this stuff up, or like life is stranger than fiction. I mean, this is such a weird thing. I mean, yeah, I'm glad that it's a good thing that voters showed them the door, because the question, outside of the outrageous behavior, being outrageous isn't necessarily a bar to being good at your job, but from the evidence that our reporters found when they went out to their districts, we found that constituents really weren't satisfied with the work they were doing. They weren't seen very often in the district. They didn't do some of the things their predecessors did.
They weren't returning phone calls.
Right, they were busy. But they also got elected on an agenda that's not necessarily enforceable at the state level, this liberty faction of the Republican Party that's very committed to making radical change in state government, and they seem to be devoting their time they were actually spending on working to doing things that maybe wasn't exactly what their constituents.
So when
Had
you
they
have
not been caught in a sex scandal, they'd have been reelected.
Sure.
No, but when
Absolutely.
you have a primary where there's so many Republican players, there is still a possibility that something
That
could
was
have
the
happened, that it
worry.
could have shaken out. So today is Ronna Romney McDaniel, who's the head of the Michigan GOP. Is she kind of all right? Let's push this to the side. Let's be done with this.
Of
now.
course, I think everybody in the state should. But the curious thing about this whole thing to me was the worse the attention got, the more Todd Courser seemed to love it. I mean,
Oh, we got a
he just
2,000-word
seemed to-
email from him just like on
I
Sunday
know,
or
he
something.
seemed to be wallowing
Mailing
in
list.
this scandal, and the worst people said about all of his bad publicity. He'd repost, put on Facebook. I mean, he seemed to love the notoriety. He felt like he was some sort of outlaw or something. This may be one of the goofiest politicians ever.
Well, they all like a little attention.
We've had some goofy
And that
politicians.
And we've had some. That is
High
saying a
bar.
lot. That is saying a lot for Michigan. All right, moving on now. We were watching another interesting race this week after a campaign marred by anti-gay and racist attacks. Ken Siver beat out Sylvia Jordan to become Southfield's first openly gay mayor. He's taking over at a time when the city is facing tremendous change and challenges, including the task of finding a developer for the massive Northland Mall property. I think this was interesting. It's always interesting to watch Southfield, where Brenda Lawrence was the mayor for so long, and now she's in Congress. And Southfield's the fourth largest city in Oakland County, so they still have this kind of a large stake, even though it's a part-time job. Essentially, the mayor's job is. So,
Is it, or is it full-time there?
yeah, I think it's a part-time job, and they also have city manager who comes in as well. But the biggest thing that the mayor is really going to have to take a look at now is this huge Northland Mall property that the city has purchased, and kind of the larger picture of how Southfield reinvents itself with now that option of property. Nolan.
I think Southfield has done a pretty good job over the years of sort of hanging on and maintaining its property values and its quality of life. A lot of the older ring suburban suburbs, were drained or being drained in the same way Detroit was as people pushed out. I think Southfield has done a pretty good job hanging on to its business base and what have you. This is a very prime piece of property at Northland. It's not going to be an easy sell to get somebody to come in and make the investment that the city would like to see in terms of mixed use and what have you. But the location is excellent. If the economy keeps growing, I think they're going to do well with that piece of property.
Nancy, I think a lot of places are watching what Southfield is going to do now, because obviously we're looking back at the history of Northland Mall, and that was really the first suburban shopping mall in the area and where people came to, and now trying to reinvent itself and say, what do you put in that place that is just as attractive in the area?
Well, and that's something that whatever developer comes in has to be really sensitive to what is going to be successful, not some cookie cutter sort of development that it could be plugged down in any community. It needs to be put into what's going to serve the area, what's going to be viable, what's going to be sustainable. But it is very interesting what's happened in Southfield. As Northland, opened, it was as sort of people started moving out of Detroit and swelling these inner ring suburbs. Then Northland, though obviously shopping malls across the country have had problems. The way we shop is changing. The things we look for in shopping experiences has changed. But Northland was also hurt by people moving past Southfield and out to the farther suburbs or the exurbs, as wealth has moved sort of out of Detroit and then kind of kept going. And now one of the things they have to compete with is that Detroit is very attractive destination right now for young people. There are businesses that have traditionally been located in places like Southfield, Livonia, those sort of suburbs that are coming back downtown. Obviously, Dan Gilbert brought his companies downtown. A lot of companies affiliated with him. Some other companies are opening downtown offices to satisfy, increasing demand, but also younger employees who want to be in the city. So this is an interesting thing of who do they go after, and how do they develop something that's going to appeal.
And I think it's still an interesting conversation about competition, because there is in Southeast Michigan, there is such a thought that everyone wants Detroit to succeed and Detroit to do well. And it's a victory when you see that more companies are moving downtown. And it's a victory when you see more workers moving downtown. But there still is that competition. You still have the suburbs saying, well, we could be losing some of those things there, Nolan.
Well, I mean, every community has got to look out for its own interest. I don't think Southfield's going to say, oh, gosh, we're going to leave this property vacant because if we develop it, it might hurt Detroit. I mean, they're going to have to make their case in a competitive way. I think there's growth in the region, and I think everybody can do well. Southfield has been an interesting community. It's got a great housing mix. It's got decent schools. It's got diversity. It's still a very attractive community.
So it's interesting. We say every community has to look out for its own interest. I understand and agree with that on some level, but isn't this also part of what we're always talking about, this lack of regionalism and this idea that that you do have to, it's me first, and that we can't build a stronger region as a whole because everyone's only invested in their own interest. I'm not saying they shouldn't develop this property to make it easier for anyone else, but it's an interesting, the way that we've done, we're not getting a lot of residents here in Michigan. So when we talk about population growing somewhere, it's really moving pieces around on the board, not net growth.
Not getting more
people
in.
It's a complicated situation here in which we're talking about one community's benefit equaling another community's maybe detriment. And but yet it seems like this is what we've been talking about for years, is that we have to maybe stop looking through that very narrow lens.
Yeah, but Detroit's not going to say, well, we're not going to build a new office tower. We're not going to
redevelop
this building because it might drain something off 10 Mile Road. I mean,
and it's just sort of a bigger picture question about how we think of ourselves as a region.
But you have to address market demand. This site can't remain empty. I think they're going to come up with, they're working with Oakland County now to try to figure out what makes sense. And I think if there's a market for development there, and there should be, given its location, they'll do okay.
Yeah, and they got to start figuring out how to demo it first. All right, and finally tonight, can't we all just get along? The Republican presidential candidates have found yet another thing to fight about. This time, there's tension over the recent CNBC debate. Some candidates felt the moderators were biased, rude, took up too much airtime. So the GOP won't be debating on NBC or Telemundo, kind of shooting themselves in the foot when it comes to courting Latino voters. We're talking about this week because we are a year out now from the election. So if you want to look at the election week. Nolan, I'm going to start with you. The GOP, they seem to be turning in on each other a little bit. How would you advise them as a party to kind of get this back on track?
Well, I think they do need to they can't have a repeat of that debate. That was absurd. I mean, I've moderated debates, you've moderated debates. You'd have never interjected yourself in a debate the way those moderators did. It was ridiculous. They lost control. They were interrupting each other. It was
I'd like to interrupt you right now, Nolan, and I'd like to take control of this conversation.
Okay.
Now, go ahead.
So, I mean, you just never see that sort of moderators. You shouldn't see moderators becoming such a big story. There's too many of these debates. I think they should be a little more selective about how many they do. And
yeah, but doesn't that come down to the Republican Party themselves? I mean, shouldn't the RNC, I mean, shouldn't they be saying...
That's what they're doing.
You know, they should crunch it down?
Yeah, one wonders if this is a bit of a pretext for realizing that maybe they've oversaturated the market with Republican debates. I mean,
I think they have.
They definitely have. We had one 2 weeks ago. We're having one
next week.
And you're going to lose your audience eventually.
Yes, you are.
There's a certain sameness to it. But, you know, they do have a good point. You look at that first question from Harwood to Trump, are you a comic book, you know, listing all the flaws in his campaign, are you a comic book? Can you imagine any moderator looking at Hillary Clinton and saying, look, you've changed your story here this many times, you've been caught in these amount of falsehoods. Are you a liar, Mrs.
All right, well, so
Clinton?
let me ask this. Let me ask this. Should moderators, let me ask this. Republicans say that moderators, there should be moderators only if they're going to vote in a Republican primary. Do you believe that that's true?
No, absolutely not.
That's ridiculous.
Okay.
But you can expect a certain level of professionalism and objectivity from your moderators, and you didn't see that in this debate. And I felt like the moderators were intentionally trying to be the story, and that's never a good idea.
Well, but that's also a product of the very, very cluttered debate schedule. Is that I'm sure everyone wants their debate to stand out and be something where something happens that people tweet about.
Well, they're trying to get ratings. Last question. We only have about 40 seconds left, though. Is the GOP, are they shooting themselves in the foot, though, by pulling a debate from NBC and Telemundo, especially coming off the last presidential election? They said we have to court Latino voters, and by pulling away a debate that would cater to those voters.
That doesn't seem to make sense. I mean, I don't know that I would pull either debate, but I do think I would sit down and ask for some sort of commitment that it's going to be not a circus.
Not a circus, Nancy. Is it possible?
To not have a circus?
Right.
Not with the
debate.
current crop they've got on that stage.
I think they've got to whittle the numbers down, quite honestly. I think
that's
there's
what
too many
everybody's waiting
people.
for.
Too many people for a debate. All right. As the world turns. That is going to do it for My Week. Thanks so much for joining us. Nancy, thanks so much for coming in. It's good to see you. Find us at MiWeek.org and on Facebook and Twitter during the week, so you make sure you connect with us there. I'm Christy McDonald. For all of us at Detroit Public TV, we will see you next week. Take care.
Detroit Public TV is supported by Business Leaders for Michigan, announcing open registration for the Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac Detroit. Topics include trends that could affect your bottom line and how well Michigan is doing in attracting and growing good-paying jobs. A great lineup of speakers, networking opportunities, and creative inspiration. That's the Business Leaders for Michigan CEO Summit, November 12th at the Westin Book Cadillac. Info at businessleadersformichigan.com/events. Funding is also provided by Delta,